It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we welcome back to the show a PokerFest main event champion, an F-Tops champion, a two-time Super Tuesday winner, and the owner of a WSOP circuit ring. He is Jonathan Apestyles Van Fleet. Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, glad to be here.
It's great to have you back, Jonathan. Well, to the hand, it comes from the online streets. It's a 6:30 buy-in. There are two tables left, so ICM is definitely a creeping factor. Faraz Jacka, aka the toilet, is in the big blind. Elliott Peterman, aka Groothedegen, is on the button. You're in the cutoff. Blinds are 30-60 with a 72-50 ante. Action folds round to you playing 4.35 million, 72 big blinds. You open the King of Clubs, 10 of Hearts. Elliott playing 3.37 million, 56 big blinds, calls on the button. Faraz calls in the big blind playing 1.75 million, 29 bigs. Nothing controversial so far, so let's move straight to the flop if that's okay. It comes the Queen of Clubs, 8 of Clubs, 4 of Diamonds. The pot is 502k. Faraz checks, you check, and in position, Elliott bets 165k. Faraz folds and you raise it to 511k total with all the back doors. Elliott calls. Now, Jonathan, I find these spots really interesting. One way I would look at it is you have a very good candidate maybe to c-bet if you were heads up, but less appealing three ways. If it checks through, you have a lot of good turn cards and can potentially fire out then. Once you check, though, Elliott bets and Faraz folds, you are heads up against the narrow range. So maybe that aggressive action becomes more appealing. Is that kind of how you look at these spots?
Well, I've done quite a bit on cutoff versus button situations and heads up pots. And I actually have been looking into multi-way spots. With root on the button, arguably I should be a little tighter. But in general, the cutoff has about like a 30% opening frequency. The button has, say, about 10%, but like capped. And then the big blind super wide. In those spots, the way that those situations play out, cutoff plays high check on a lot of different high card boards, especially two-tone boards, and button gets to fire a lot. I chose to check raise because I play a high check raise frequency in these situations, and I thought it was a reasonable candidate hand to do so. And you guys have done solves on it because I haven't yet.
Well, step up there, Dara.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really not very expert in these multi-way spots. So I just was interested to see if we ignore the big blind, particularly after he folds, what we would do. And yeah, it is a spot where there wouldn't be very much leading. And this is a hand which is a very good candidate to check raise. You know, a double backdoor hand. Those type of hands tend to make good bluff check raises because they give us good board coverage and a lot of runouts. And yeah, it's a good way to balance the value range. The one thing that I was interested in that John said there was how often the button is supposed to stab. I'm not sure how much more they should stab heads up versus multi-way. I get that, for example, ace-high hands don't have as much showdown three-way, so maybe he should start stabbing those hands because it's three-way, or is it the case because it's three-way that he has to actually be more careful because he still has the big blind to worry about? So that's a spot where I have to admit I'm really unclear.
It's actually about the two low cards with the ace high boards, especially when it comes to like under the gun and button. Like if it's under the gun button, ace high boards with another high card are super high frequency bets, especially like king high card. But if it's like ace 4-2 two-tone, super high frequency check.
Yeah.
And that has to do with, in that specific spot, the bottom sets that in position has and out of position doesn't have. But also because of the equity of all of our top pair hands, they're just not really three street hands on a lot of different runouts.
Well, to the turn, it comes the 9 of clubs, one of your best cards, certainly. The pot is 1.52 million and you bet 503k. Group calls. Jonathan, your bet here is unlikely to get raised because you have top set and flushes in your range, I guess. This bet sets up a 90%-ish pot shove for the river, which by then you might be doing for value or as a bluff. How much of Elliott's range are you expecting to get folds from here and now?
If you think about the composition of my check raise range and the composition of most people's calling range and position, my check raise range has these combo straight draws with backdoor flush draws that hit. Like that's my bluffs, right? Then I have my actual value range on the flop, and then I have flush draws. So it's just a very, very good card for out of position where I believe that we get to bet with range about 100% frequency. Now, in solvers, it'll be something more like 80%, but for me, it's close to 100 and it's easier to round up. So I thought that a lot of one pair hands, like pairs without clubs, I believe I had fold equity, but it also had to do with the fact that I have equity on the turn. So I'm semi-bluffing, and it's a very, very good turn for my range. And I do plan on most likely running it on most rivers too, as a bluff.
I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, when we see that turn card, it is one of the turn cards we're hoping for. The whole reason why we choose this type of hand as a check raise bluff on the flop is that there are a lot of good turn cards like this where we pick up equity. And also, as John said, this just looks like a terrible card for our opponent.
I think if you have king, queen of hearts or something, like you're already considering folding.
Yeah, certainly you're hating life. Well, river comes the king of diamonds. The pot is now 2.53 million. You bet 10%, 253k. I think both Dara and I both misread this when we first looked at the hand history. We thought you just mashed that pot bet. This card changes everything, it's got to be said, because with the rivered straight or flush, you would be betting big here for value. On a lot of bricks, you would be bluff shoving. With top pair, you overtake the queen jack, queen 10, maybe ace queen if you decided not to 3-bet that. So you switch to a 10% block bet, which I didn't really know was a thing. It also sort of, well, I don't want to spoil the next bit, but it also ends up being sort of an inducer as well. Can you go into more detail on the logic of that decision?
So if we're going to talk about river bet sizing, generally the largest determinant of river bet sizing is the equity of our value range. I'll give you an example. We're in the big blind. We've called the raise from the hijack. We've check called any flop. It's gone check, check, and we arrive at the river. Out of position on almost every river in this line arrives with an equity advantage that's mostly obtained by low and middle pairs. Just good equity hands, like 60% equity, 65% equity. So we build in that spot a min bet or a 10% sizing for that part of our range. It's actually principled. And it's about 70% middle and low pairs and about 20% induces is what I usually do. And about 10% bluffs, which is pretty fun when that gets through. It gets through quite a bit. In this particular line, it is a dominant option chosen by solvers. So I'm probably screwing myself by telling the world this because it's one of my most useful tricks because it allows you to avoid one of the more annoying situations. Because not in this case, but in most situations, it actually acts as a blocker. It acts as something that prevents people from betting, actually gets them to fold sometimes, and a lot of the times call with worse because it's just so small. They want to see what you have, right? So that bet size is designed for the part of my range that has between like 55 and 65% equity on the river out of position. In position, we don't have a small bet. So my thought process in the moment was that my hand had around 60, 65% equity and that I couldn't really see myself shoving and getting called by worse very often. But I thought that there's not much difference between a 10% of pot bet and a check in most scenarios. So I don't really mind doing it. Basically, it brings your opponent out of the game tree that they've studied. So that was my thinking in the spot, is that I had a little bit part of my range designed around king X or check raised over pairs. That was betting small and bet calling. It might be nice to see what ICM hypothesizes about my actions, but there was also game flow stuff going on there and the possibility of covering a very, very tough player in position.
It's interesting. Dara, I know you ran this in a solver both without and with ICM, and I know depending on how much you dial up the ICM, it actually quite dramatically changes Jonathan's supposed action here.
Yeah, well, I mean, when ICM is a factor, it changes things dramatically all the way back to pre-flop. And that makes it difficult to do a match and compare. Because, for example, when ICM is a factor, John's range probably widens somewhat, but it also kind of the shape of the range changes. We open more high card blocker hands and we stay away from small pairs, that sort of stuff. In positions, range dramatically changes because he's the covered player. So he actually has to tighten up. So that kind of changes the thing so fundamentally that you can't really draw too much conclusions. Like when I put this in a solver, I ran it with ICM and without ICM. And with ICM in John's river spot, he was checking the river, whereas without ICM, it was betting. But I think that was a function of just with ICM, the villain's going to have a much stronger range on the river.
So the picture of ICM is actually constantly flowing. And I think that in the next 5-10 years, we'll have not necessarily a new model, but ways of engaging with the model to make better decisions.
That's really interesting. Well, look, I did kind of spoil it there a minute ago, but in response to your 10%er, which I guess is, as you said, kind of like a check. So maybe, as Dara pointed out, the solver likes checks. It's not so different. Elliott shoves for 2.21 million total. You need to put in 1.96 million to win a pot of 6.96 million. So you need to be good about 28% of the time to be indifferent. With ICM, you need to be good a little bit more, obviously. Dara, what's a decent ballpark for how often Jonathan really needs to be good, factoring in ICM and obviously his skill edge versus the remaining field?
We're 2 tables out here, so I don't think the risk premium is massive here. Also, obviously, it's not all of our chips. So we need to add on a small amount, but not too much, I don't think.
Is it like an extra 3%?
I don't think it's going to be as high as 3%. No, it's probably more like 1%.
Well, I've been looking a little bit at ICM post flop and ideas like around this whole pressure idea. And it's interesting because when you do have someone covered, what I see is that the chip leader can generally put a lot more bluffs into their range.
Yeah.
Bluff to value frequencies increase. However, your value range, because you're up against a tighter calling range, gets tighter. So there are some things that happen with bet sizing in these post-flop sims, and there are some things that happen with bet frequencies because our value ranges change dramatically, even when we have someone covered because of the fact that their get-in range is tighter.
Yeah, I actually did a session with a student just before this, and we did look at some post-flop ICM spots. And one thing which jumped out was when you're out of position and you're the player who's exerting ICM pressure, you move all of your strong hands into that range because, you know, your range can't always be just full of crap that you're just trying to push the guy around because you have more chips. So you do end up putting all your nutty type hands into that range and using that then to have a shit ton of bluffs, basically. The other thing which was interesting was that different stack sizes, the bet sizing just swings wildly. It seems to come down to the biggest determinant of the bet size is not so much the range versus range equity in an ICM extreme situation as just how much chips the effective stack is. And sort of the player exerting the pressure is making bets in earlier streets, which is threatening that the all-in is coming on the river, which is quite interesting.
I do love it. And that's the fun thing about both multi-way pots and ICM that I'm seeing is just lots of clicking. lots of tiny bets, lots of ducking and weaving and jabbing and poking. And I love that stuff because it gives me more options. You know, ICM in general seems to lean towards smaller bets from what I've seen.
Well, let's get back to this hand because I am fascinated to do the little conclusion here. So, Jonathan, you eventually make the call and get shown the ace of clubs, jack of hearts. Elliott bet his own backdoors on the flop. He called with those same backdoors and position. He picked up a good card on the turn. He missed the river, but facing your teeny block bet, decided to turn his nut flush blocker into a bluff. To be fair to him, he had a pretty good candidate, blocking both straights and flushes. Unfortunately for him, though, you also had straight and flush blockers. Dara, can you go back through Elliott's line across all the streets and line it up against PO's preferences?
Yeah, I think the river bluff makes absolutely perfect sense for the reasons that you went into there. It's one of the best bluffs we could possibly choose. I think the turn call is completely standard. We've also turned equity and we're drawing to the nuts, so it makes perfect sense to call. The flop, I mean, I don't feel qualified. I haven't done enough work with multi-way solvers to know what the betting range should be. Just eyeballing it, I was a little bit surprised at this hand bet, given the fact that it's 3-away and also it's an ace high. But I mean, we do need to find some bluffs here too. So I would be interested to hear John's thoughts on betting the flop with this specific hand.
I've actually been really, really surprised at how much in position gets to bet, especially considering the population probably puts too much value in their betting range. I think it's probably a mixed strat, but I don't mind his flop bet or his call on the flop. I don't mind his turn call, and I actually don't mind his river bluff either. His most questionable play is probably whether or not to bet the flop. And I suppose mine is the river min bet. But again, I don't think the EVs really differ too much from check. And whether or not I get to check raise on the flop, I think that I get to increase my check raise frequency and volume because of the stack size and pressure. And that it was pretty similar to some chip EV spots that I'd looked into. And that's how I was evaluating it in that moment. Mm-hmm.
Well, look, it was a fantastic hand full of blackboard potential. Thank you so much for going through it in such fantastic detail. Jonathan Van Fleet, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate talking to you guys.
Thanks, John.